Understanding China has become more difficult than ever, yet also more important than ever. Hardening geopolitics has made travel to China more difficult, but not impossible. Join me, Scott Kennedy, for an on-the-ground look at China, for conversations with people shaping China and scholars exploring the country firsthand. What makes China tick? Where is the country going? How should the U.S. respond to the China challenge? We'll dive into all this and much more on this podcast. Welcome to China Field Notes. Hi, folks. Welcome to another edition of China Field Notes. As I mentioned on the first episode of the season, when we talked with Evelyn Chung of CNBC, we're making two changes. First, our podcasts are more frequent, now twice per month rather than once per month. And second, we're expanding the range of guests to include not only Chinese and long-term foreign residents of China, but Western scholars and others who travel to China for their work. Their on-the-ground perspectives provide critical insights into this complex country. And I could not be happier and more honored that the first person who fits into this broadened category of scholars who do fieldwork in China is Jessica Teets of Middlebury College. Jessica is a professor at Middlebury, which is based in Vermont. She's also associate editor-in-chief of the Journal of Chinese Political Science, and her research focuses on governance in authoritarian regimes, especially the role of civic participation, and with a regional focus primarily, although not entirely, on China. She has written a lot. Her most well-known book is called Civil Society Under Authoritarianism, The China Model, which was published by Cambridge University Press in 2014. She's also editor with Bill Hurst of Local Governance Innovation in China, which also was published in 2014, and another edited volume with Max Gromping of a book called Lobbying the Autocrat, The Dynamics of Policy Advocacy in Non-Democracies, which came out in 2023. And she's now working on another book on governance in China under Xi Jinping. She's, of course, also published a slew of articles in the field's most important journals, from the China Quarterly to World Politics to the Journal of Contemporary China. I've admired Jessica's work and her persistence for a very long time. And so I'm beyond delighted to have an opportunity to talk with her today about her research and doing fieldwork in China. So Jessica, welcome to China Field Notes.
Thank you for hosting me.
It's really a delight. I can't think of any scholar who does fieldwork in China more rigorously than you, and who ought to help us get this conversation started, because you are a pathbreaker for the field as well as now for our program. Let me, before we dive into the details of some of your recent research and the findings, just pull back a little bit to understand how you got interested in China and why you decided that traveling there and being there on the ground is a good way to understand the country.
I could give you a very long answer to that, but I'll give you a shorter answer to that, which is just that I originally was studying French politics when I was in college, and this was in the 1990s. And, studying politics in a lot of other countries, there are sort of laws, like things that we know, things that are stable, that you sort of, once you learn them, you know them, and they apply all the time. And China's not like that at all. So China is always a hard case to understand. Things change quickly, especially, in the economy. And it was just such a fascinating country to try to understand. Starting for me, in the early 1990s, I studied abroad in 1995, 1996 academic year in Beijing. And it's a place where I feel like I'm constantly learning and constantly being challenged. I never get comfortable. I never assume that I understand what's happening. And, for me, that kind of challenge is really amazing. Plus the food, right? You have to pick your fieldwork locations where you have good food.
Of course. Yeah, I always tell people that I want to be surprised on when I go to China, and it's not hard to get surprised. So what about, so you've been to a lot of places in China and tried food around the country. What's the most interesting place that you've visited all these years that you've been going?
I was counting it up this last time that I was doing field work, and I've been to all but 6 provinces. And my favorite, of course, is Yunnan and Sichuan provinces. Those are my 2 favorite provinces, although I also really like Heilongjiang. That's another really great province. The fascinating thing about being in China is that it seems like every place you go to has something really interesting to see, like a UNESCO World Heritage Site and, some local dish that they don't make anywhere else in China. And so that's the fun thing about doing fieldwork in China, is that I would encourage people to try to go to lots of diverse sites, because each one you go to, you think, wow, this is the best place I've ever seen. And then the next place you go, you think, this is the best place I've ever seen. So I tend to return mostly to Yunnan and Sichuan. Those are my 2 favorite provinces, but there are just so many wonderful places. This last trip, I went to Jiangxi and Fujian province, and I hadn't been to either of those 2 provinces before. And the tea culture in Fujian was just amazing. That was something really amazing to see.
So the diversity of the country, I think, comes through in what you're saying. And if you like Yunnan and also Heilongjiang, opposite ends of the country, very different physically, food, all different kinds of things. Yeah, there's a lot for people to try and experiment with. You've also traveled to China recently, as well as going back a few decades, and the big intervening thing that occurred is the pandemic, when none of us were traveling for a time. Also, U.S.-China relations has gotten stickier, more troubling, more problematic. How did the pandemic affect traveling in China, doing work in China? Do things feel different qualitatively now than they did when you were traveling before?
Yes, I think so. I mean, obviously, people couldn't really go to China. It was very, very difficult to go to China during that time period. And so it sort of gave us this like 3-year break in being able to see the progression of what was happening in China. So when I was first able to go back, I was really amazed at how quickly an alternative ecosystem of like apps and online payment and booking tickets online, and how quickly that sort of ecosystem of, I don't know what you would call it, like a super app platform had developed in China. So it was there before COVID, and increasingly people used, WeChat or all the Alipay ecosystem. But you felt like it was sort of an opt-in. You could do things the old way, but you could also do things this way. And when I returned, it was basically that almost everything was done completely online in one of these ecosystems. And so that presented a challenge for field work, in that these super app platforms have some barriers to entry that are hard for foreigners. They've tried to fix a lot of these since they opened back up after the pandemic. It's still really challenging if you don't have a Chinese phone number or a Chinese bank account. It's really hard to get access to train tickets or to get a taxi or do things like that. So, I mean, that's a very practical challenge that we see with field work. But that's one thing that people really need to understand before they go to China, is exactly how they're going to pay for things or get paid or travel. As far as the bigger changes, there was always a little bit of an undercurrent, especially in the foreign policy, international relations area, of sort of anti-Americanism, or maybe a better way of describing it back then was competition, right? That the U.S. was sort of seen as at the top of the pile. And so for IR scholars and people who study foreign policy, all of the discussions were always around, when will China overtake the U.S.? Or when will China, be number one and the U.S. will be number two? And it felt like after the pandemic that sort of rhetoric just became really common. And so, in areas of scholarship where you wouldn't normally have that sort of discussion, you would see people talking about things in a competitive way, like a zero-sum way. If the US wins, then China loses. And so that's created a lot of problems for fieldwork, depending on what sort of questions you want to look at. That instead of this idea of, the US is doing it certain ways, China's doing it other ways, we can learn from each other, learn about the successes and failures from each other. Instead, it seems to be more this idea of, if one of us fails, then the other wins. that has been problematic in that instead of just trying to avoid Chinese political sensitivities with your fieldwork questions and the way you talk about your fieldwork in order to get people to be willing to sit down and talk to you, you now also have to deal with the fact that you're from the United States and you're a US scholar. And the presumption is that you're advising the government, and therefore anything they share with you can go to the US government and might be used against China. So that's added on this layer of, we always had to be careful when we were framing our fieldwork about, we're not trying to criticize China, we're trying to learn from China. But now there's this added thing of, how is the information going to be used? Will it hurt China or will it be used to help China? So it's sort of added on that other type of sensitivity.
Yeah, that change in geopolitics and all the other things, that's really helpful to hear. Yeah, first, the logistical challenges of operating in China have gone up. And then I think this risk aversion that Chinese have, because their relationship is more tense, that might affect what one can do on the ground, who one can talk to, what they might say, and so, which makes what you do even more amazing. Let me ask just one more question about this. And because unlike me, you're female, and China treats men and women differently in many situations. But from our perspective, you're a leading authority. When you're in China, does your gender have an effect on what you can do and how people respond to your work?
I think that it does. I mean, in a lot of ways, it reminds me of being a political scientist in, the early 2000s in the United States, where oftentimes when you walk into a conference or a panel, you quickly realize like, oh, I'm the only woman here, right? And so it's still like that a lot in China. So a lot of the conferences and panels and presentations I went to, I was still the only woman and now the only foreigner in the room. And so that, that has both hard parts to it, but also it makes me sort of unique. I'm the panda of fieldwork. I'm the only woman and the only foreigner, so I'm special. So in some ways, people listen to what I say more than they would otherwise. I think that young Chinese women academics have a much harder time than I do. I think that they have a much harder time being taken seriously, but that's also changing a lot. I mean, two really surprising trends that I saw on a lot of campuses this time in China. One was the sort of solidarity that young female faculty and PhD students had, where there were a lot of informal mentoring sessions and advocacy for each other. So it wasn't just trying to get ahead for you yourself, but it was trying to make sure that there were always other women in the room. That's really good to see, I think. And then the other thing was also just focus more on privacy. And that doesn't have to do with gender as much, although women seem to be a lot more sensitive to this than a lot of the men. But there was this real pushback against facial recognition and all of these sorts of tracking mechanisms that we see on campus. So a lot of the female faculty that I was spending time with, these were the two big issues that they were really worried about and really trying to advocate for inside of their institutions, getting more women in the room and making sure that there were more privacy rights.
That's really, really helpful and very useful context for thinking about the work that you're doing and the results. And also not just amongst the community of scholars and students that you interact with, but also the officials that you interview in different parts of the country or do focus groups with, and the extent to which gender may affect how Chinese officials behave. And maybe that's something that we'll come to in just a little bit. Let's switch gears now and talk a little bit more about the research that you do. And I want to break this up into two parts. The work that you did on civil society in authoritarian contexts, and then the more recent work on governance under Xi. And as I mentioned, your book that came out in 2014, you also had a great China Quarterly article in 2013. You've published a lot of great stuff, but called Let Many Civil Societies Bloom, The Rise of Consultative Authoritarianism in China. And a lot of us back then did work on civil society, looking for whether it exists in China, whether economic reform was the source of it, would it lead to democratization, a lot of ways. And none of us seem to just sort of accept the standard original idea about civil society and what it would mean for China. What was your take about the evolution and development of civil society in China in that particular context?
Well, that's a really timely question because I'm actually starting a new book manuscript trying to look at the evolution and development of civil society in China from like the mid 1990s until today. So I've actually been thinking a lot about this. My perspective when I first started studying civil society is that it seemed that the government considered it to be another tool, another way to do sort of social management work. So instead of mass mobilization that you saw under Mao, it seemed like this was a way to reach out to people who had interests or authority in society. They were already identifying themselves as leaders and people who had, a particular interest in an issue. And so from the local government's perspective, it made sense to work with these groups and try to achieve shared goals. Now, of course, problems came in when there weren't shared goals, when civil society groups wanted something different from the government. And problems also came in when, local government wasn't necessarily sure what civil society would be doing, and they worried about the risk of it. And so that's how they developed the management tools that they use for civil society. So registration rules, as well as, control over funding and resources. And I think what we see now, so the charity law was just revised in 2023 and went into effect last year. And it really shows this evolution in learning. So learning about crowdfunding and, more of a modern civil society where there are influence campaigns and, the use of the internet and crowdfunding and all of these sorts of things. And so you see the government really trying to learn from this and try to figure out how best to harness it, but control it, right? So it's not that they're necessarily opposed to civil society. They've created a whole new category of civil society groups that are these professional social work organizations. And you see these in the well-developed cities like Shanghai, Shenzhen. This is almost another sector of the government. And these are private organizations that hire social workers and then accept government contracts, but they're the ones who determine the parameters of their work. And then they'll actively lobby the government to change rules or laws that they think are causing problems. So we still see that civil society is active in China, but the way that the government has learned to change the ways that these organizations are able to have a legal status and also the ways that they're able to get funding have created groups that still advocate, but most of their funding is through the government. And so they've had to learn this advocacy style that's almost right next to the government. Like, how do you advocate maybe in opposition in certain ways to the person paying your bills, right? And so that's been a challenge then for these organizations. But I've also seen really creative adaptation on the part of these organizations. So one example is one of the environmental groups that I've been talking to for over a decade. The national government has increasingly created these really technically sophisticated environmental protection rules. They pass them down then to the local government at like the township level and say, your water can only have this parts per microliter of this particular thing. And these township governments don't have the staff in order to actually implement that. Like, what does that practically mean for their workflow? They don't really know. And so they have been contracting with these environmental groups who have scientists who work at universities and citizen scientists who volunteer with them. And they'll contract with them and say, rewrite our regulations so that we're adhering to the law. And then these organizations are rewriting these regulations, and they're including things in there like citizen comment periods, public notification processes. Now, are these required by the law? Not really, but they're best practice in the environmental community. And so when you ask environmental organizations to take national technical laws and write them into governance practices at the local level, they're using their own experiences as far as what what would good laws look like? And they're writing these things into regular practice then. And so we sort of see this explosion around China of a lot more public notice, public comment. I wouldn't necessarily call it participation exactly, but it's definitely consultation. And for certain groups that have power or authority, depending on the topic, or groups that have good resources, they are actually able to play a consultative role. So we still see that, but I definitely think we see sort of the more sophisticated application of consultative authoritarianism. So there is consultation, there is public input, but it's being done in this really professional way that privileges the bigger and more well-resourced groups over like smaller community groups.
That aligns with what I've seen in business government relations and how businesses have evolved, how they've tried to shape policy. I think when I was first doing research on this, there was an immense amount of business lobbying, sometimes through these government-created associations, sometimes through sort of grassroots organizations, but oftentimes one-on-one, where companies, because they're big and they have access and have ideas on policy, would find the right place to shop their ideas and attempt. Sometimes they cooperate with foreign businesses. I think it's become a lot more organized and ritualized and consultative. And I think explicit efforts of pressure seem to be an absolute no-no these days. And so what about some elements of civil society outside China in democracies include two other elements. One is narrative shaping, where it's sort of defining the problem is these organizations may do. And the second is accountability. Do you see narrative shaping and accountability in these activities?
Yes, although I would say that probably starting in 2016, but definitely by 2018, I think you see a lot more constraints in both of those activities. So narrative shaping used to be a really important tool that civil society groups would use, especially with local governments. They would try to conceptualize something like HIV/AIDS not as a drug use or sex worker issue, but as a public health issue, and try to move it from one ministry or agency to another that they felt had maybe a more similar or more sympathetic approach. So you saw that a lot more. Now what I see is that they're still trying to do that work, but they're trying to shape the narrative inside the framework that's been laid out by Xi Jinping and the Central Party. So it's a little bit more of what you saw under Deng Xiaoping, where it was sort of like, this is what the leader said, and this is how our work helps the leader accomplish his goals, right? And so they're still trying to shape the narrative, but the ways in which they're doing it have sort of been collapsed into this one framework of this is what the party leadership wants, and this is how our work is doing it. And some people, some organizations are more creative with that than others, especially organizations that have leadership where the leaders have like a source of authority, like their parents, were strong communist members, or they have some sort of source of authority that gives them a little bit more freedom. But I have seen that the narrative part of civil society has been constrained a lot more, given just sort of the party's leadership in this area of ideology. As far as shaping the different solutions or the advocacy, like how should you resolve this problem, I still see that organizations are really proactive there in trying to come up with a different solution set. And so I think that area is a little bit more open than trying to frame what the issue is. So once the issue's been framed, then there are a lot of different solutions and still lots of, pilot studies and different reports being issued. And so I still see a lot of diversity and a lot of activity once the problem's been framed and we're looking more at what's the solution that could be used. So I would say there's a little bit more constraint in the first part.
Sure. So would there be any way to learn about all of these things if you weren't on the ground in China, talking to these groups repeatedly over the years, if you were just, say, going to their website or reading Chinese official media or books? What's the value added for being on the ground, and how on earth do they trust you enough to share all of this really interesting information?
I don't think that there's a good way to learn about it in a really deep way without being in China. I think that it really depends what sort of question you're asking. So, some of the research that I've seen that look at like civil society projects, where are they based? Which groups are they dealing with? Who's paying, who is the grant coming through which agency? Some of that sort of empirical information, I have seen good studies that use like web scraping or other things from outside of China to try to get leverage on what's happening in China. But as far as like strategic choice or how these organizations are responding to the changes in their opportunity structure, I just don't see how you would do that without being able to talk to people and participate in their activities. As far as the question of like, does it have to be me who can do it or a brand new scholar, who's like researching for their PhD dissertation and they want to go do field work and this is their first year in the field and can they do that work? I mean, trust is of course important, but there are lots of ways of creating that trust. I'm relying on historical trust, that you've talked to me in the past and I, haven't gotten you in trouble and I've, tried to report what you've said in a good way. But I do think that for younger scholars who are just starting out, that if you go to events that civil society groups are holding, they hold lots of workshops and symposium and, there are different research institutes in like Shanghai and Beijing. And, if you go through those channels and sort of go in through the academic link to civil society, I think that it is possible to build up trust. And then especially scholars who are doing more participant observation, where they're spending more time on the ground with these organizations, they are building up trust and they are getting access to great information and great insight. But you can already tell from my answer, this requires more funding, right? So what in exchange for the ability to create that trust, you need time. And so that's where we need more funding sources for people to do fieldwork in China. It's still possible, just like in the past. You have to be careful with how do you construct your questions? And, do you try to do interviews in the 2 days before the Lianghui meetings? Or do you, find a less politically sensitive time? All of those sorts of constraints are still there. So you can still do the sort of field work that you and I are used to doing, but it requires more time. So you need to have a way to build that trust. So you either need good connections. I teach in summer school. So how the Chinese academic calendar has sort of an extra term after the spring semester ends. I've been teaching at a university at Zhejiang University in their summer school. So I'm part of the faculty. I'm attending meetings just like everybody else, working with students, seeing what the faculty WeChat groups are talking about. You can build that trust, but you need the time in which to do it. And so I think that that's something really important for more senior scholars and people like you to advocate for, which is we need funding for junior scholars to be able to spend more time on the ground.
Indeed, indeed. The whole pipeline from undergraduates to graduate students to young scholars, that funding actually is going in the opposite direction right now with cutting or eliminating Title VI and FLAS and all of these things. It's a giant challenge. Hopefully, that's not a permanent problem. Hopefully, people recognize the value and strategic value to the United States and us from doing that. Let's shift gears and talk a little bit now about governance and how things have changed in the last decade, looking at from the government perspective, not necessarily from civil society groups. The area in which you excel looks both at what central authorities are trying to do and change how they interact with localities and manage the country as a whole, but also how local officials, whether we're talking at the province level or cities or counties or townships, how they respond to the changing incentives and institutions. And I do think that there's a general sense amongst scholars that there's been centralization in China since Xi Jinping came back into power. But at the same time, I think people also walk around in their heads with this idea that the sky is high and the emperor is far away. Or as people say, 上面有政策,下面有对策, the top has its policy and localities have their ways of responding. How do those dynamics look to you based on the work that you've been doing?
Yes. As I feel like this could be the answer for every question about China, there is a lot of change and continuity, right?
Yes.
So I've been working on a book manuscript, which is currently under review with Dr. Gao Xiang at Zhejiang University. And we've been trying to understand this huge institutional change process, because even if you're just looking at the institutional, like the formal institutional change that's occurred in China, most notably in 2016, but then also again in 2018, and then again in 2024, there have been sort of 3 rounds of these big institutional changes. And what we've tried to look at is we've tried to look at the institutional changes for the policymaking process, like how policy is made and implemented and enforced. And then we've also tried to look at how civil servants are managed by the state, because you're right that it's not just the formal rules, it's also how those people in those positions decide to interpret or not these different rules. And so the people and the policies both matter a lot. And so in the book manuscript, we look at the changes that we see in both of those areas. In short, what we're finding is that there is a lot more centralization in policymaking as well as control over civil servants. So how they're promoted, how they're punished. There's increasingly a lot more punishment. We didn't used to see very much punishment. It was sort of heavy on the promotion side. So heavy on the carrots, light on the sticks. And we've seen that change now to much heavier with punishment and not as many promotion opportunities or ways that people could benefit. And so in short, what we've seen is that even though there have been a lot of institutional changes and centralization of the system and more control over civil servants from the top, we still do see that there are local sources of adaptation and response. So in policymaking, what we tend to see is that local officials have done 2 things. They have more strictly implemented whatever comes from the central government when they have to. But when they don't have to, they've done almost nothing. It's sort of this weird veering back and forth between overactivity and complete paralysis. And in the meantime, you might say, what are they doing? Like, how do they get away with these periods of paralysis? What they've learned is that the government is monitoring the process of governance and not necessarily the outcomes. And so for local government officials, they're constantly filing these work reports through these centralized electronic systems. So they have to go in and file updates to like poverty alleviation or other big governance responsibilities that they have. And what is being tracked is whether they hit those particular check marks, right? So not necessarily are you reducing poverty, but did you check in with your poverty households? And so a lot of times what we see is that local government officials will go visit these households and they'll take several rounds of pictures in different clothes. And then they say, yes, I'm meeting with these households, and they upload pictures to show the evidence of this. The pictures were all taken at the same time, but they wore different clothes, right? Like a winter jacket for winter time and, short sleeved polo shirt for summertime. And so what we see when we talk to local government officials and in our surveys with them is they're reporting that they're spending 40 to 50% of all their work time just filing these reports, not actually doing governance, not being out in the community to see what's going on, but simply filing these work reports to tell the level above them, yes, I saw your check mark and, I checked that box. And so those are the sort of 2 adaptations we see at the local level. So there is this more centralized policy where the central government says, we want to see X. And then there will be a leading small group that will take charge of that policy, and they will send work teams out to all the local governments, in sort of a wave pattern in order to make sure they're enforcing it. During that period, that's where we see sort of overactivity. That's where we see that they're enforcing these policies on anybody and everybody, even people who aren't necessarily covered under the policy. Just to be safe, you want to over-enforce and you want to over-implement. But then when these work teams leave and they go into this sort of work report culture of governance, then we see paralysis. So they're not trying to innovate or come up with, policy experiments. They're not really trying to do much of anything other than just file these work reports and show that they're hitting the goals. Because the problem is that if you do something innovative and try to take initiative, there really isn't much of a benefit anymore. So those things used to get people promoted, even if your initiative or your local experiment failed, just the simple fact that you were trying to solve a problem sort of was a signal that you had leadership potential and you would get promoted more quickly. But now it's mostly risk. Really what happens to most of these people is that their policy experiment then becomes a pretext for investigating them for corruption, or if it fails, then, they're a failure. And so there's a lot more risk and uncertainty. And what that results in then is people just sort of keeping their head down, doing their job, right? Exactly what they need to do and nothing more. So that's mostly what we're seeing then. And we also see that there are a lot of changes in the governance process using digital monitoring systems. So that's been a perennial problem in Chinese governance, which is how does an upper level of government know what lower levels of government are doing? In the past, they've had to rely on the local government to tell them, what they're doing. And of course, the news is always wonderful, bumper harvests and, everything's wonderful. And so now what we see is increasingly the central government has been pushing the use of digital monitoring systems. These are good in some really technical areas of governance. Like if we go back to thinking about environmental policy, these digital monitors that are put in waterways or are mounted on top of roofs, and they're sending, up-to-date technical information through these sensors, that sort of information can be really useful for governance. So it doesn't matter what the local government says they're doing. You can see what their air quality is or their water quality. But in other areas of governance, these systems are really challenging to actually use. The things that they're trying to measure or the ways that they're doing this measurement are resulting in sort of absurd politics, right? So again, the example that I gave of poverty alleviation, going out and taking pictures of these poor households, forcing them to change their clothes 3 or 4 times to reflect seasons so that you can then upload those pictures. So in that type of a system, is digital governance actually changing the local governance on the ground? And in that case, we find that it's not. It's actually, in some cases, creating worse outcomes. And so that's a challenge going forward with digital governance. And it's also incredibly expensive. A lot of people in the West, when they talk about these systems of monitoring, whether it's local government or local residents, they seem to imagine that because you can do this technically, that it's being done. But in fact, what's happening is local governments collect information through legacy systems. To be able to get every local government to update whatever system they're using so that they can exchange information seamlessly with all other local governments across region, across policy area, all the way up through the province, and then across provinces and all the way up to the central government. I mean, that task costs so much money and is really problematic. Who's going to build that system? And so what we see instead is that the central government has made this mandate, but they've let provinces deal with it. And for provinces, they've tried to push local government to create these systems, but local government has said, we don't have the resources, the human resources or the monetary resources. So instead, the compromise is that everybody still uses their legacy systems, but they have to report certain pieces of information into the provincial systems, which then go up into the central systems. But that you can see already the problem there, right? We're right back in the same situation where it's curated information. I'm reading what I want you to know. And is that really accurate? Is that really what's happening? Does that help us understand local governance anymore? I think in some ways, digital monitoring creates the appearance of more and better information. and actually results in worse information, but you don't know where those gaps are anymore. So, I mean, there are some advances here with this more centralized governance system. We see less corruption. We see more policy standardization, but we also see some really big problems that are going to need to be addressed.
You mentioned two. One is formalism and paralysis. I think what Chinese call tongping or lying down and not carrying out their duties in an effective way, which the leadership has criticized a lot of times. Of course, these are one set of problems. I guess if you go back to when Xi Jinping was getting ready to assume power, at that time, China had lots of corruption. It had local party organizations which were going their own way, a weak foreign policy. And so I think the decision was, let's be more Leninist. Let's get back to our roots and we'll exchange one set of problems potentially for another. I guess it's a trade-off when you decide to be more Leninist as opposed to letting all of this experimentation go on. You get a different set of problems. I wanted to ask, you did a bunch of interviews with officials, focus groups, participatory observation. You did a national survey. How on earth are you able to do all of that? And did the things that you learn in one form of field research, like a survey, did those align with what you learned when you did the interviews or the one-on-one conversations where obviously you and your team and Kaohsiung, you have more context to talk to officials? What were those different types of fieldwork tools like? And was there any variation in what you learned from the different ones?
That's a very thoughtful question, because I think part of what you're getting at is that there are certain research tools that might appear that they can deliver better research results, but they all have weaknesses. And so if you can bring together more than one, hopefully you can counteract some of those weaknesses. And I think a good example of that is the survey that we did. So Kaohsiung and I did a national survey of local government officials. We had about 5,000 respondents in 28 different provinces, all local government officials. And that kind of reach is really interesting to see patterns, but then you have to interpret the patterns and see exactly what they mean. And so one thing that came back in the survey was that local government officials were saying, we sort of asked them a series of morale questions, but we try to ask, we don't say like, do you support the Communist Party and Xi Jinping's leadership, right? So instead we try to ask in lots of different ways, like more personal ways. And one of the questions that we ask is, would you want your child to be a local government official like you are? Because that really gets at the heart of what people think about their jobs. Would you want your child to have that job? And so we've asked that question before, and usually we had really, really high rates of people saying, yes, I would absolutely want this for my child. And last year when we asked this question, we ended up with people just not knowing. They wouldn't pick an answer. So they picked the middle, like neither yes nor no answer, which to us, I mean, I guess you could read that as saying like, oh, they just don't know. But in previous years, they've always known. And when you talk to people, they will clearly tell you whether it's a good idea to work for the government or a private company or whatever else. And so we read that as just a lot of uncertainty. They don't know if that's what they want for their children. They don't know how, anti-corruption campaigns or the benefits and disadvantages of being a local government official will move forward. And the time commitments and the pressure have dramatically increased while the benefits have sort of fallen away. And so what we did was, in order to try to understand if we were reading that correctly, like how do you read that sort of uncertain response? That's where we then talked to local government officials, and we tried to talk to them more like we would go to talk to them about a particular topic that they were interested in hearing about. They wanted to know, what is the state of research about a particular governance topic? And then, of course, you'd be walking to the dining hall. Most meals for local government officials are in inside of their own dining halls now because of all the strict regulations about meals and drinking at meals and who pays and all those sorts of things. And so that's when we would have a chance to just say, would you want your child to also be a local government official? Like, things have changed so much since you picked this job. You know, is this something that you would want for your child? And to listen to what they had to say about that. And, you know, for most people, there was just a lot of uncertainty and this kind of, thinking of a good way to explain it, sort of this dismay that there's so much distrust for local government officials. Most of them went into the local government because they're from those communities and they saw it as a way to give back, really sort of the public servant mentality of being a civil servant. And a lot of them, you know, pursued education and certificates and a lot of higher education. And they regularly meet with university professors or other experts to try to learn best practices. So they invest a lot in their jobs. And I'm not saying that there aren't local government officials who are corrupt or who are lazy or not interested in doing a good job, but that's not the majority. That's the minority. And so for the rest of these civil servants who've chosen government service, there's this feeling that basically the central government uses them as a sort of a blame game, right? If things don't work out, if the economy isn't going well, it's the fault of local government officials. And so there's a lot of distrust for local government officials in their community. And there's a lot of pressure for them to achieve results with low budgets and lots of constraints. And so I think they just feel really pressured, right? There's a lot of stress and pressure, but they don't feel like they have the tools to necessarily do a good job. They've lost their autonomy. They've lost their budgeting autonomy. So they're increasingly squeezed into a small box where they don't have a lot of tools, but they're expected to sort of single-handedly revive the economy or solve youth unemployment or the housing crisis. So it's this really uncomfortable position that they find themselves in. But uncovering that kind of nuance and complexity, I don't think that there's any one research methodology that you could use. It's really using a combination of all of them. And to be able to have access like that, people really need to have good local partnerships. So, you know, continuing to publish with our Chinese colleagues, or as I was saying, you know, teach in summer sessions or go to conferences, go to workshops. A lot of the people that are going back to China go for very, very short periods of time. So that's better than nothing, right? And for a lot of people, that's the best that they can do between all the demands of work and home and everything else. But the longer that people can spend time there, the more that they can build up these trusted relationships. And if it has to be short, quick trips, to do them regularly and frequently, right? And I think that that's really important to make sure that we have access to the types of research and the types of interpretation of our research findings that we need.
I think what you're showing from what you just described about these different methods is that you capture even more than nuance, even more than texture. You're capturing how people in the system, the significance that they attribute to all of these changes. And that tells you a lot about the sustainability of this or the weaknesses of the system, which makes me want to ask a broader question, not just about where China is going, but since you're a comparative politics expert and you try to understand China in the context of other countries, I think around the world, governments are facing a crisis of authority, right? People have been challenging them because of globalization or immigration or economic slowdown, and they increasingly question authorities, whether that's governments, it might be doctors, it might be lawyers, people in finance, might be university professors. Or we're seeing this around the world, including in the United States, right? You described a bunch of risks that you identify in China, the unhappiness of officials, the either hyperactivity or the passivity of local officials in responding to the central mandates and these campaigns. Are China's risks that it faces in governance more or less massive than the types of challenges to authority that we're seeing expressed in other countries, might be other authoritarian countries or might be democracies like the US? Where does China fall on the risk spectrum of governments these days? Sorry, that's a really vague, open-ended question.
And, if I knew the answer with any precision, I would probably earn a lot more money than I do right now, right? But it's a good question to ask because I think, especially among my Western colleagues, I get the sense that a lot of times they think that Xi Jinping is single-handedly responsible for most of what's happening in China today. He's the most powerful leader since, Mao Zedong or maybe Deng Xiaoping in some limited way. And that really he is just sort of forcing everything he wants through the system. And that's the best way to understand what's happening in China today. But I think, and I could tell from something you said earlier that you don't hold that view, and neither do I, which is that the reform era governance model resulted in a lot of governance failures, including epic levels of corruption and policies that looked great on the books, but weren't being enforced at all or even implemented. And so all of these governance failures were really, really obvious, probably about midway through Hu Jintao's rule. So you saw Hu Jintao himself try to centralize politics and talk about party leadership, bringing the party back in. And he just wasn't able to do it. He didn't have control over the levers of power, and he didn't have enough political support to actually do it. So a lot of the policies that Xi Jinping adopted when he took power were Hu Jintao's policies that just failed. And, so Xi Jinping picked them up and had the political will at that point to push them through. But that political will came from the biggest consensus that I've seen in Chinese politics, which was party elite saying, if we don't respond to these governance challenges, we're going to lose the economy. We're also going to lose party leadership, which I think they valued more than the economy. And so they really viewed this as their last chance to intervene. And that if they didn't intervene, China would go the way of Russia and these other post-communist countries. And so the party leadership was really united behind Xi Jinping. That's how he was able to take power so quickly. And anyone who wasn't behind him was sort of very quickly retired or moved out, right? And so there was a lot of support from the leadership, which was important. But there was also a lot of leadership from regular people who were also tired of corrupt local officials and all of these sorts of governance scandals. And so he had a certain political honeymoon period where I think he was able to do a lot of this institutional change and really push through a lot of reforms. And then you could face this new era of what are the results? Is he going to be able to benefit from the results? That's a little bit more unclear to see because there were the intervening variables of the COVID pandemic, as well as what's happened in the US and international trade wars. So I can't say whether those initial reforms that he implemented in 2016 and 2018 would have been successful or not. We can only sort of see what the situation is now. But the situation right now is bad. It is, I'm trying to remember another time that I've been in China where there was so much social unrest from every area of society, and I just really can't. So the grumbling that, you used to hear under Jiang Zemin from like business about, how they were being held out of government and they weren't able to lobby or have any sort of influence in policy, or people complaining under Hu Jintao that he was ineffective and that, whatever good policies they had, he just wasn't able to enforce them. All of those complaints are back. So local business is complaining, local government are complaining, regular citizens are complaining, and more worrying for Xi Jinping, party elites and political elites are all complaining. And this used to be something that maybe after a long dinner, several hours together, a few drinks, people would say like, oh, I don't think that Xi Jinping is doing a very good job in this one aspect. Now, instead, what you see is that people are openly talking about governance failures in lots of different areas and all the mistakes that they think that Xi Jinping is making. And I just haven't seen that since he took power. So this is new, this level of social unrest that I'm seeing. And you have to wonder where it goes, because if I know it, of course, Xi Jinping knows it too, right? And so, one response that we see is sort of heightened anti-corruption campaigns being used to remove party elites, even people that he put in power who you would see as party loyalists. But again, when you get that paranoia going of I'm losing support and people might try to force me out of my position, you see that sort of witch hunt, right? Like, who can I remove? Who is leading these efforts among the elite? And then at the local level, we see increasingly strict censorship. So for example, in my slides for giving presentations in Zhejiang province, I wasn't allowed to use Xi Jinping's name. So he became kind of like Voldemort, he who shall not be named. So we had to talk about senior party leadership or the chairman. Like, we had to use these terms that you haven't had to use in Chinese studies in a long time. You were able to say Deng Xiaoping or Hu Jintao or Jiang Zemin's name. And so there is this feeling that things have got to change and that people are really, really dissatisfied, that they feel that the policies are not working, that they're failing. And so it's unclear to me what that will look like. Big financial stimulus, but there's got to be a change. So that's sort of a long answer to a really hard question. But that's what I'm seeing, is that this support that he's been able to depend on in society and among party elites, it's gone and it's reversed. And so now he's much more on the defensive.
Well, I bet you he's aware, which is why he's been doubling down on these various different ways to try and rein things in, and whether it's purges or more control, the sticks you mentioned before. Yes, in terms of how to refer to him or the leadership, I've heard people in China say boss number one, Di Hao Laoban. I've heard people just say he. And I've heard that even saying he sometimes might be risky. So it's a different environment for sure. This has been an absolutely fascinating conversation. It's really inspiring because the insights that you've gained and you continue to gain through fieldwork on your own in collaboration with your colleagues in China, it's really a model for the rest of us. It's a guide for the rest of us. Yes, we have to use all different kinds of methods, and sometimes that means data scraping and reading lots of documents. But a lot of what you do in the different ways, whether that's surveys, interviews, et cetera, it's invaluable and it's irreplaceable. And so I want to thank you not only for joining us today, but for all the work that you and your colleagues have done. I really want to thank you so much.
Thank you. And before we end recording, can I mention one other thing that I noticed in China that was very different this year?
Please, please.
All of the workshops and conferences were in Chinese. The flyers advertising them, the main language for everything, the agenda, all in Chinese. Even though a lot of, and again, it wasn't that there were a lot of foreign guests who were participating, but even when there were foreign guests who didn't speak Chinese, everything was done in Chinese. So that was this really interesting thing where they seem to have switched from English as like the main academic language to Chinese. They've sort of revived. I don't know if you remember Deng Zhenglai, the dean at Fudan.
Yes.
Right. And so you remember his, Chinese academics need to recreate the field in the image of China, right? Not ape the West. That has sort of reemerged as the modernization of China. And so now everything is being done in Chinese, which is partially, I think that's really exciting. I mean, I like to see that Chinese academics are saying, we can host conferences in Chinese, and we have lots of foreign friends who, are presenting in Chinese and are participating in Chinese, and that's fine. But on the other hand, it's also sort of an interesting response, I guess, to problems with the United States. The other interesting thing that I saw was that their way of getting around this was the use of AI technology. So for all of the foreign guests, they were downloading the WeChat app that will do simultaneous interpretation. And I was looking over a German scholar's shoulder at the conference so I can hear the Chinese, and then I was like looking to see what it was saying for him. And it was really good. I mean, it was fast, because normally there's a lag if you try to use something like that, right? Then, people have moved on and you're still reading what they said 5 minutes ago. So it was really fast and it was really accurate. It just had problems with some of the lingo, right? Like really technical words that you would use. But otherwise, I thought it was pretty good. So anyway, that was something interesting that I saw. So again, that is something that tells us we need to really invest in language study because we need people who can go to conferences and present and listen and participate all in Chinese.
That's really, really interesting. I know for people that do comparative politics and do field work, using Chinese professionally is quite common. For a lot of folks who do international relations, foreign policy, US-China relations, it's not as universal. And you see more events when they participate in China in English. All of us are going to keep traveling and we'll be able to see how broadly this approach is implemented. And then whether it comes with translation tools or folks in booths or what have you. I think if it was the change, if it occurred all at once, I think it would be quite limiting for a lot of IR scholars. But that's really, again, as you said before, things keep changing and you can't just depend on how things were last year for how they're going to be next year. Again, thanks a lot so much, Jessica, for joining us and participating in China Field Notes.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening to China Field Notes. Stay up to date with our latest releases by following us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to great content. Until next time.